PFC has a big task to review the draft EIS for the Lost Creek Boulder Creek Landscape Restoration Project. So the purpose of this video is to help provide you with some suggestions on how to make that kind of an evaluation. The November 6th meeting, the interdisciplinary team reviewed their work, and so you have that background. And then months ago, the PFC adopted a business process in the format of a swim lane diagram to define the respective roles for the ID team, the PFC, and the line officer. And at this stage in the process, it's important to recognize that the review of the draft EIS, the product of that review rather, will be a comment letter. The recommendations that the PFC adopted in January of 2013 will be the baseline for comparison, and that's what I'm going to describe in quite a bit of detail. But it is not an opportunity to go back and redraft recommendations. It is a comment letter with respect to the draft and how that draft compares to the goals and objectives of the Payette Forest Coalition for the Lost Creek Boulder Creek landscape area. Now, I will be asking you, after you have time to review this information and to think about it, I will be asking you to complete a survey, and the results of that survey will be posted on the forum, and we'll also provide the background information to identify issues for the December meeting, and it is the December meeting which will be the wrap-up meeting for adopting a comment letter on the draft EIS. So first let me begin by letting you know what the survey is going to look like so that you have an idea of what to expect at the end of your review. And the survey has a brief introduction that says, based on the interdisciplinary team presentations and your review of the draft EIS, I'd like you to assess the 5 alternatives. And this is just in general an assessment at this stage. I'm not asking you to vote on a final alternative that you are willing to support. I want you to answer this question: does the alternative support the PFC's 5 goals by meeting or exceeding the objectives for the goal? And then it goes on to say, for each alternative, indicate in the form below the PFC goals which you conclude are adequately supported by the alternative. So on the form, there are 5 alternatives, including the do nothing, and then the 5 columns are the coalition's goals, and the order from left to right is based on the priorities that the coalition discussed at their special meeting in July. So Watershed Health was the clear top priority over on the left. Over on the right, access and recreation was clearly the 5th priority, and then in between are, in descending order, are wildfire, wildlife, and economics. And then down at the bottom here, there's a text box where you can enter questions or issues that you feel need either additional answers from the ID team or else further discussion at the December meeting, or discussion of a different sort on the forum. It's an easy form to fill out. So say, and you should mark the check boxes for each of the alternatives. But just using alternative B as an example, let's say you concluded from your review that it met the Watershed Health objectives. It also met the wildfire and wildlife objectives, and you felt that it satisfied the access and recreation, but not the economics. And you could type in a comment here to further explain why you chose that. You would then proceed to mark the PFC goals that you think are satisfied by each of the other alternatives. And then when you are done, you click Done, and your responses will be submitted. And again, I'll compile a summary of the results and post those. But I wanted to forewarn you that you should keep that in mind as I go through and give you hopefully some helpful hints on how to structure the review. Okay, let me begin with Watershed Health as the first goal, and remember that I'm using the PFC recommendations from January of 2013 as the baseline. And so in this chart, I have the 5-6 level watersheds listed on the left, and then the current condition is the first column, and that's alternative A, the do nothing alternative. And then we have alternatives B through E, and then a column for the coalition's recommendations. Now the watershed condition, I'm using the watershed condition key over here on the right, the colors that the Forest Service has used nationally. So if it's functioning appropriately, the color is green. If the watershed is functioning at risk, its color is yellow, and if it's an impaired function, the color is red. So the current condition, 4 out of the 5 were assessed with an impaired function, and the lower West Fork of the Weiser River was in slightly better condition, and the conclusion was that watershed was functioning at risk. Over on the right, the coalition's recommendations were priority 1 was the Boulder Creek watershed, and the objective was to improve the watershed condition indicators enough that the watershed would transition from impaired to functioning at risk. So that's the meaning of the yellow color. The 4 remaining, the recommendation was pretty much the same for each one, and that was to improve the condition indicator ratings if sources of funding permit. So in other words, the priority was for Boulder Creek, given all the costs of the project, if it was possible to also make some improvement towards the desired condition in each of the other 4 watersheds, then those were a lower priority than Boulder Creek. Now, across all 4 of the action alternatives, each one of them meets the coalition objective of moving the Boulder Creek watershed from an impaired function to functioning at risk. All 4 of them also make some progress towards Upper Weiser River, Lost Creek, and Upper West Fork of the Weiser River, but each of those watersheds would still remain in their current condition class, and the same is true for the lower West Fork of the Weiser River. But I think what's important to recognize is that there is a distinction in particular between alternative C, where C makes more improvement in each of those watersheds with respect to the desired condition than B, D, or E. And then if you look at alternative E, it makes less progress for Upper Weiser River, Lost Creek, Upper West Fork, and Lower West Fork of the Weiser River compared to alternatives B, C, D. So in short, in terms of the coalition's high priority, they all satisfy that objective. For Watershed Health, C goes above and beyond and makes more improvement in terms of reaching the desired condition. And then C overall makes more progress in each of the 5 watersheds than the other action alternatives, and alternative E makes a little less progress than the other alternatives. I'd like to proceed with vegetation treatments, and vegetation treatments affect both the wildfire objective and also the wildfire goal, as well as the wildlife goal. And so I've combined these, and the summary form is in the format of a chart. In the table up here, it lists B, C, D, and E, and then the Payette Coalition's objectives with respect to acres treated to promote or retain large tree size class stands. And I am, in general, interpreting this to be stands that would have a commercial treatment. So the coalition's objective from a summary table in the recommendations report was roughly 13,600 acres should be considered for commercial treatment, and that shows up in this bar in the chart. Alternative B is a little over 15,000 acres. C is less than that and is the lowest of all of the alternatives, and it's 10,100 acres. D treats 16,400 acres in order to promote or retain the large tree size class, and E is 14,300 acres. So in terms of sort of an eyeball look at this, E comes close to meeting the PFC objective for this type of vegetation treatment, and alternative D exceeds that objective. Somewhat related to that is the treatment of acres for northern Idaho ground squirrel, and I think it's important to emphasize this because improving wildlife habitat for the ground squirrel was an important goal, wildlife goal for the project area and for the coalition. The coalition had made a rough estimate last summer based on the results of field work by the ID team, and an initial estimate was an objective of 1,608 acres ought to be treated. In the draft EIS, there are two priorities, and the priorities are combined in this chart for each alternative, and you can see that each one of the alternatives exceeds the coalition objective for treatment of northern Idaho ground squirrel habitat within the project area. A vegetation treatment that's, I think, a little bit trickier is we had quite a bit of discussion within the coalition, starting with the Vegetation Committee and then with the full coalition on the treatment of small and medium tree size class stands. In the recommendations report from the coalition, I'm summarizing the acres, departure of acres across the primary PVGs of interest that represent the shortfall in large tree size class stands. And in other words, how many acres would you need to recruit from the small and medium tree size class stands in order to make up the deficit? And in round numbers, that summary was 12,900 acres. The coalition did put a disclaimer on it that small tree size class stands should really only be considered if they're in a block with other treatments, and then an economic caveat for the medium tree size class stands is that the ID team should tread with caution in order to ensure that the project is still able to demonstrate that forest products can offset a portion of the costs of restoration. And since much of this non-commercial thinning could be expensive, that was the reason for the word of caution. So given that background here, the 12,300 acres is a rough estimate of the objective, and the assumption is it would be less than that given the other factors to consider. Alternative E is close to that, 12,000 acres. B, C, and D all exceed that objective, which is not necessarily a good thing in this case. There was a couple of spatial priorities in the coalition's recommendations, and I think the ID team did a great job of creating an objective, a quantitative measure for estimating the percent departure from the desired condition 25 years post-treatment. The PFC really didn't define an objective for it, but I want to highlight this because I think it is a very useful way to look at the outcome. And there is a similar summary for immediate post-treatment conditions, but I think the 25-year one is particularly of interest. So in this case, the lower value is actually more desirable. You want to have the departure overall PVGs to be less. A is the no action alternative, and the departure from desired condition would be 69%. Alternative B changes that lowers that to 46%. C is in the same range, 49%. Alternative D, 37%, and alternative E is 41%. So in all cases, each of these action alternatives improves the vegetative condition, and I think that has spin-off impacts for both wildfire and wildlife. The other spatial consideration, going back to the northern Idaho ground squirrel, for that specific type of wildlife habitat, the draft EIS indicates that those treatments would be, especially in the priority 1 stands, would occur adjacent to occupied stands that do have the ground squirrel present, or at least they have been observed to be present there. I'm going to move on to the economic objectives. The coalition had 3. The first was dealing with the change in annual employment and income, and the coalition really did not adopt a number here, but did recommend that the appropriate analytical tool be applied to make that estimate for each alternative in that comparison. So in the table here for each of the 4 alternatives, there's a estimate of the annual jobs supported by the restoration actions, 63 for B, 46 for C, 77 for D, and 64 for E. So out of these 4 alternatives, D is the highest, E and B are fairly close together, and C is the lowest. Annual income associated with those jobs, this dollar amount is in the thousands, so it's 1.8 million for B, 1.3 million for C, 2.3 for D, and just shy of 2 million for E. And in graph form, the annual income is shown here, with D being the highest, C the lowest, and B and E fairly close together. A quantitative objective for the economic considerations that the PFC adopted had to do with the ratio of revenue from forest products to total project cost. And that revenue, the source of that revenue number, 22%, was an estimate from the 2011 CFLRP proposal that was submitted to Washington, D.C. So this, in other words, the stumpage revenue should be a minimum of 22% with respect to total project costs. Well, in the economic analysis from the draft EIS, all I did was take the table of the discounted cash flows, the costs and the revenue, divided revenue by cost, and in chart form it's shown here. B is, I should say, first of all 4 of them are less than 22%. B is just under 12%. C is the lowest, 6.1%. D is 16.2%, and E is 18.2%. Now again, the idea here is not to become overly focused on harvest level, but to really meet or be consistent with the CFLR Act that created the program, and part of the objective of that legislation was to demonstrate that forest products can offset restoration costs. And then the PFC corresponding goal is to demonstrate financial responsibility as part of the restoration action. So you could look at this very simply and say, well, gee, none of them hit 22%, but E comes closest, so that's the preferred. I think maybe a more interesting way to interpret this is if you were to divide the forecasted revenue by 22%, you'd get a new project cost in order to try to hit that 22% objective. So for B, if you took the revenue and divided it by 22%, that means the total project cost ought to be $3.1 million. C, I think, is the real eye-opener at $1.5 million for revenue. If you divide that by 22%, then we should be looking at a project cost of $6.8 million. For D, it raises the project cost to just shy of $19.5 million, but significantly less than the estimated cost for all restoration treatments that were included in alternative D. And then E, dividing it by 22%, the revenue of $3.9 million, the total project cost would be $17.75 million. So to continue on just for a second with that approach, it means that in order to meet that objective, it would require a reevaluation of these other project-related actions and their costs, and decide which ones ought to stay in and which ones ought to be dropped in order to come in under the resulting project revised estimate of the total project cost. And in addition to the objectives, the PFC adopted I guess what you would really call an indicator, partially in response to criticisms in the first project that it was overly aggressive with respect to harvest level. And so this indicator is in part addressing that issue. And in graph form, in a sense, it's comparing the Forest Service performance to what would be expected by a private landowner operating within the state of Idaho. And in this chart, on the y-axis is the percent of growth harvested, and on the x-axis is the percent of growth that's retained on the stump. Now, I did this by making an estimate of annual growth, applying that to the forested acres, and then assuming for a minute that it was a private landowner. A private landowner with more than 5,000 acres would be taxed in Idaho based on a land expectation value. What would the property be valued at if you had an infinite series of annual payments based on harvesting roughly the annual growth? If you were to do that on the graph, you would be at this point at the y-axis where you'd be 100% harvest and 0 retain. If the landowner had no harvest, you'd be at this end of the graph where you would be 100% retained and 0 harvest. Since this is a project for the Forest Service, everybody recognizes that it is not the same as a private owner, but this is just, again, a relative indicator. Instead of being up here at 100% harvested and 0 retained for the growth over the 10-year period, all of the alternatives move down to the right. And there are a variety of reasons for that, including the forest plan, the management prescription categories within the forest plan cause the project to harvest less than growth. In particular, there is an inventoried roadless area within the project. Also, the coalition is focusing on certain PVGs and tree size classes and canopy closure classes. So that also has the impact of moving the harvest level down and retaining additional growth. I do think what's interesting, though, is that all of them are relatively modest. I think D and E could be considered approximately the same roughly around 60% retained and 40% harvested. B is a harvest level of about 28% of growth, less than a third of growth over the period. And C is harvesting 14% of the estimated 10-year growth. And then the other aspect of that is that the growth that's retained also has a value to it, and that could be interpreted as an opportunity cost. In order to conduct the project with the strategy of that alternative, what is the opportunity cost of retaining a substantial percentage of the growth over that 10-year period? And again, there's a variety of good reasons of why you would want to do that, but I think it is a useful number to get a handle on what the cost is for the project of retaining that volume. The fifth goal topic is access and recreation, and the coalition did not have a quantitative objective for how many miles of road or any other. Although the coalition didn't have a quantitative objective for access, I think ID team came up with some interesting measures, and two of them are here, dealing with suited timberlands within 1/4 mile of a system road on the left, and on the right of the percent change in acres in proximity to a system road. So starting off with A, using the technique that they did to measure the acres within 1/4 mile of a system road, A had just under 50,000 acres, 49,830. B had 48,900. C, 44,281. D, 48,900. And E, 49,000 acres. So in essence, it's a measure of, given the road systems that are there, including road closures, how many acres are within 1/4 mile of that. So road decommissioning, road obliteration would change that figure, and that's reflected in the different values for the acres. So A has the greatest, of course, because there would be no road actions. B, D, and E are all very similar, and C has the greatest reduction. And showing those same changes as a percent change in the graph on the right, C has the largest percentage change of a little over 11%, and B, D, and E are all in the same range of reduction of 1.5% to 2% of the area in close proximity to a system road. Okay, so I hope that gives you just a little bit different way of how to approach this. I want to emphasize that what we're doing here is taking the objectives that are presented in the draft EIS, and in some cases the indicators of environmental effects, and using those to assess how the alternatives stack up with respect to the 5 PFC goals. And the quantitative objectives and the PFC recommendations are the main source for that comparison. So when you've had time to think about those examples and the ID team presentation, as well as looking at some of the other summary information in the executive summary of the draft EIS, I'd like you to come back to the survey and complete it. And again, the task at hand is to look at each alternative and simply mark a check under each PFC goal where you think the alternative is either meeting or exceeding the objectives for that PFC goal. Do that for all of the alternatives and enter in any additional issues or questions you have into the text box on the form, and then click Done. And I'm going to ask that you complete that part of the process no later than the 14th of November, and then I will summarize and post the results by the 18th of November, and then you'll have an additional week after that to look at the summary results and the comments from other PFC members, and add any additional comments that you have on the forum. The ultimate deliverable from this process, again, is a comment letter that will be submitted to the Forest Service, and I'm hoping that this process will help identify issues that need to be discussed at the December meeting.